Yeah. So, hi everybody. This is Lourdes from Seville, but now from Madrid. From my house, lockdown. I'm going to present like 5 minutes, really short presentation about the Design Futures Initiative, because most of you already know about us. And I will leave all the Zoom to Grace. I really don't know what she's going to be talking about, but I'm really sure that it's going to be mind-blowing, because always is. Presión, no pressure. So DFI, Design Future Initiative, is a non-profit organization, originally from San Francisco, but now is all over the world. The founders are designers. In the beginning of the organization, most of the community were designers, but now we have people from all type of backgrounds. We have scientists, strategic artists, psychologists, anthropologists, all type of backgrounds. The main objective is to think and talk about what is really desirable as future, for what, for whom. So sometimes we think about one future that is desirable. We have to think in a systemic perspective. Now we have more than 40 chapters around the world. It's really growing fast. And also the Design Futures Initiative is, they organize 2 international conferences, one in the United States and one in Europe. It's called Primer, and we were the organizer last year in Madrid in October. I actually met Grace in the last Primer US in June in New York. I attended one of their workshops. This is our amazing team: Ruben, Andrea, Milla, Steph. Hi. And this is our social media and Slack channels. You are more than welcome to continue the conversation. And also, if you want to be involved, if you want to be our guest, so just write us. We will be delighted to know more about you. And that's all. Grace, I will present her. Let me finish the presentation. So Grace, it's really difficult to define what you do, because it's really multi, a lot of things. I knew that you work in Deloitte Digital, but you do a lot more beyond that. So I know you are post-disciplinary designer and researcher. What I really like about you is this performativity and play point of view to explore different futures and expand imaginaries. So yes, I think I will leave the space for you, Grace, to start your presentation.
Okay, which space? This space or this space? Okay. First, I want to just start with a really funny story. This guy I was giving a presentation for something in Sydney, and this guy asked me if he can take a photo with me, and I was like, why do you want to take a photo with me? But sure, let's take a photo. And it was because he I think he's your friend, Steph.
Who?
I don't Juan. He's like, I'm gonna show my friend Steph, and I'm like, okay. Anyway, hilarious story. Not really. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so yes, I think Lourdes is right in that I'm quite hard to define. I do consider myself a post-disciplinary designer because I feel very funny about definitions in almost every aspect of my life. So I avoid disciplines, and therefore I am a post-disciplinary designer. But in saying that, I do come from a very strategic and research-oriented design background. But in that, I've always engaged with futures. And so my practice really centers around how to play with the future. Today, what we're going to be going through is really some of my foundational thinking, but a lot more on becoming. And so, and this idea of the future as a mirage, disorienting the present. And I just want that to stay with you because I don't want to say what this means. It can mean many things. But I want you to think about it, and then we're going to come back to it at the end of the presentation. Oh, I'm not presenting properly, am I? So becoming is a very playful research studio based out of Barcelona. Becoming has existed for some time now, and has it is made up of 4 people with really curly hair, which is really exciting because it's very rare where your whole team is all got curly hair. And we come from the background of technology and interaction design, sociology, more, you know, transition design, aesthetics, and myself, whatever that is. So we are an adventurous research studio. And basically what we do is we try to engage and mess with emerging scenarios to reframe worlds otherwise. And we do this by exploring the in-between. And I think this is what we're going to take you through today. And what we do is we do this by embodying futurity to preempt how our behaviors shape and inform worlds of tomorrow. So central to that is really the fact that we engage with imaginaries, we play with futures in order to transform the now. And I think if you think of, you know, typically what is someone engaging with futures aim to do? They aim to anticipate what could happen, what is likely to happen, to orientate action in the present or plan for that change or to inform that change. And I think what makes the work that we do slightly different is that it is all about the interventions of the future. It is not about suggesting this is what the future could be, but it is about looking at all of the different parameters around the things that I'm just going to go into it. So basically, we live in somewhat of a matrix, right? And I remember the first time I watched The Matrix, I must have been 12. And I was so excited because, you know, I was this really, you know, emo, depressed 12-year-old that was like, what is the meaning of my life? As many of us kind of probably had this experience. And then I saw The Matrix and I was like, oh my God, we're living in a matrix. We need to break out of this matrix. And so ever since I was a child, and even before I was 12, this resonated with me because I've been trying to break out of the matrix. I was a very strange kid. I used to build things a lot by myself. And I used to do things like, you know, build things to speak to aliens. And I have a lot of sisters, and my sisters would be like, what are you doing? And I'm like, I'm trying to speak to aliens. Leave me alone. This thing is really, you know, I come back to this thing a lot because I've thought about it a lot, and it is essentially what I'm trying to do right now, which is essentially do the impossible. Because we need the impossible, we need to break out of the matrix, essentially, to be able to imagine worlds otherwise, but not just worlds otherwise, but ourselves otherwise, right? So the matrix is important. We should just continuously watch the matrix.
In fact, the heart of everything we'll be doing in Disney World will be our experimental prototype city of tomorrow. We call it Epcot, spelled E-P-C-O-T, Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow. Here it is in larger scale. Epcot will take its cue from the new ideas and new technologies that are now emerging from the creative centers of American industry. It will be a community of tomorrow that will never be completed, but will always be introducing and testing and demonstrating new materials and new systems. And Epcot will always be a showcase to the world for the ingenuity and imagination of American free enterprise. I don't believe there's a challenge anywhere in the world that's more important to people everywhere than finding solutions to the problems of our cities. But where do we begin? How do we start answering this great challenge? Well, we're convinced we must start with the public need. And the need is not just for curing the old ills of old cities. We think the need is for starting from scratch on virgin land and building a special kind of new community. So that's what Epcot is, an experimental prototype community that will always be in a state of becoming. It will never cease to be a living blueprint of the future, where people actually live a life they can't find anywhere else in the world. Everything in Epcot will be dedicated to the happiness of the people who will live, work, and play here, and those who come here from all around the world to visit our living showcase. We don't presume to know all the answers. In fact, we're counting on the cooperation of American industry to provide their very best thinking during the planning and the creation of our experimental prototype community of tomorrow. And most important of all, when Epcot has become a reality and we find the need for technologies that don't even exist today, it's our hope that Epcot will stimulate American industry to develop new solutions that will meet the needs of people expressed right here in this experimental community.
Okay, so this video is another thing like the Matrix that is really important to me because Disney is a dickhead. But more importantly than that, I went to Epcot when I was 9 years old, and it was fascinating because it is essentially you're going through an exhibit of the future. And I was deeply affected by this image portrayed of the future through Epcot. And because of how it was staged, because of how I experienced it as a child, it was deeply affecting. It changed me in some ways. But then, you know, later on, I lived my life and I come across this video and I learned that Epcot, this experimental community of tomorrow, is actually, you know, it wasn't intended to be a theme park. It was intended to be a living prototype. But it was intended to be a living prototype that was embedded in the values and beliefs of American free enterprise. So it wasn't by community, it wasn't by the people that were going to inhabit this space or interact with this space. It was a future that could have been potentially enforced on particular communities. And for me, this is a real issue, right? Because basically what it says is that this vision of the future of how we interact with technology, how we exist in this state of becoming, is dictated by particular powers that mean that we do not decide what our future is. Our future is prescribed to us. And this is the thing, again, it reinforces what I said about the Matrix, in that we consume futures. And the futures that we consume, they shape our imaginaries. And in shaping our imaginaries, they inhibit us from imagining worlds otherwise, right? So it's been my mission, and a lot of the work that we do with becoming is to break down those barriers to imagine worlds otherwise by whatever means we can. And it's important because basically the world we live in that has been prescribed to us is prescribed to us from very selective and few individuals, their powers. So in this car is Walt Disney, Henry Ford, and Robert Moses, who at the time of this in 1964 was the mayor of New York. So this is a car. There are the 1964 World Fair. So they shaped that narrative. They shaped the futures that were consumed, that would bring in cars, that would say, this is how you will interact with the world. These are the things that you will transition to. And so if we were to take those futures back, if we were to dismantle those futures, what would exist? And that space really is hard to define, because the imaginaries that these few men and others that are similar to them have really shaped our imaginaries and inhibited us from imagining things otherwise.
You're doing it.
Doing what?
Using your imagination, Peter.
So, you know, obviously a few movies really kind of stuck with me, but this is important. Neverland, to me, is super important, because what Neverland creates is this speculative reality, this fantasy world, which we can inhibit, which we can play with, which there is conflict, where there is good, there is bad, there are magical powers, and it gives us a very honest reflection on our reality and how we can start to change that. And this is important because continuously, and maybe because I'm looking for it, I hear things like, no one has any vision for a different or better future. And that where you're not confronting an energy crisis, but one of the imagination. And we are facing this dead zone of the imaginary. And everyone, or most people that are trying to act on the world differently, they're trying to create other futures or move us towards other futures. And if you consider what we're dealing with right now, you have constantly these set of scenarios that people are moving towards that really don't suggest radical change for us right now in how we transition to them. And almost by setting specific scenarios in the future, if you think of 4 futures, then immediately you're inhibiting anything else from happening, because you're saying, no, you will inhabit one of these 4 futures, but there's a multiplicity of futures. You know, that's kind of one of the premises of futuring, that it's plural, that there's a multiplicity, that we should consider how we decolonize those futures. But by prescribing what the future is, you almost ensure that we will inhabit one of those futures. And that is often what we want to do. So we want to anticipate what the future is to be able to respond to that, to move towards it or away from that. But what if by just prescribing a set of 4 futures or a few others, even we throw in some wild cards, what if that inhibits us from actually enacting change? And that's just, I don't know, that's a question, right? And it matters what stories we tell other stories with. It matters what stories make worlds, what worlds make stories. So who's telling the stories right now? Who is shaping the stories that we consume, that we decide to act on? And what are the variables? And I think through the work of becoming, the thing that we are most interested in are those variables. Are reframing the stories that we tell stories with, that shape actions, that create other futures that exist potentially outside of what we believe could be possible, so that we can start to move into impossible areas, right? So when I started exploring performativity in futuring as a way to explore impossibilities, I was introduced to this quote by an Australian futurist called Tony Fry. He wrote a brilliant book called Design Futuring. I recommend everyone read it. And I asked him, I was like, I can't handle the fact that all of these futures are prescribed to us. How do we break out of this? And then I read this quote, and this was a few years ago, around the idea of moving from possible to impossible. And by moving from possible to impossible means that it expands what we can do. It expands the unknown space to inhabit and experience worlds that really exist outside of the limitations of our imaginary. And then there is this other quote around dreams, and the fact that when you turn dreams into something that is tangible, when you turn dreams into language, it also dissolves the meaning of that dream. So how can we dwell in the dream space a little bit more? And obviously, we need to locate things. We need to model things. But when is the right time to model things? And when is the right time to dwell in the dream? And if we dwell in the dream, does it allow us to expand our imaginaries more? This is the thinking, right? And then, because I'm looking for it, I came across The Theatre for the Ridiculous by Charles Ludlum. And he was this kind of pioneering queer activist in New York who was pivotal in the Stonewall movement. And I really like this because he's introducing this element of ridiculous, impossibility, preposterous, ridiculous. The situation that we're going through right now is kind of ridiculous, you know? And so we need to act irrationally. If a situation is ridiculous, you need to be irrational. You need to understand that we do not act on the world in rational ways. We act on the world through our spirituality, through our gut, through our sexuality. And how can we start to use those different dimensions of our intelligence to act on the world potentially differently? So with all of that in mind, we start to be able to reframe how we perceive the future, how we act on the future. And I'm sure everyone on the call is very familiar with the kind of futures, in that there are possibilities and we move towards what is preferable. Maybe sometimes we can even go back and look at what was in the past and see how the pendulum swings from the past to the future. But what if we look to the future as if it was some non-time? What if it existed outside of a spatio-temporal context? Does that allow us to inhabit that space of possible imaginaries that allows us to think of how we can transition from the now to other worlds in a way that we could not have possibly perceived before? Because we have to deal with this reality where all of our mental models, all of our beliefs, all of our ways of seeing and acting on the world are very loaded from many different things. And this, I'll let you watch this. By taking this perspective, it allows us to look at people and futures as dynamic systems. And right now what we're seeing is a dynamic system where everyone is connected, right? So this system of individuals, so we can consider it a microcosm of individuals, they move together. And they move together because they've been connected. And so the future doesn't exist as, you know, 4 different possibilities. They're always interacting with each other. So it's not like we're going to move to one future or the other. We're probably going to move to multiple futures at the same time, and they're constantly going to be a conflict. Which is why when we're considering the future, we're looking at relationships and implications. We're looking at the dark matter between possible futures more than the possible futures themselves, because then we can see what is the structural things happening that is causing things to occur, right? And then how can we potentially shift that? So what we've done to be able to deal with this level of complexity is apply methods using different tools and techniques from the futures fields across strategic foresight, transition design, speculative design, design fiction, and adversarial design to create performative and participatory kinds of engagements that we can start to tease out very wild becomings. Not so much points in time, but the way that things emerge and become otherwise. And the way that we do this is we borrow from role-play games, teatro foro, presencing theater, systems theater, experimental ethnography, and other things to be able to create different experiences for diverse audiences, to be able to enact and imagine very divergent futures that exist outside of the possibility, that really do showcase what is impossible to help us better orientate our action now and reflect on the present. And if you consider post-normal times theory and the fact that our times are complex, they're made up of chaos and contradiction, this is not something that just by looking at complexity we can fully make sense of. So in making sense of this complexity and chaos and contradiction that we live with, you need to go outside of the possible to be able to really understand how do these things converge and how do they manifest differently to be able to make sense of. Otherwise, it's going to be, I think it's quite difficult. And there is a limitation in not being ridiculous. I think being ridiculous, you get like, it's just so much easier to be when you're ridiculous. So one way that I was really influenced by this concept of using your body, playing games, embracing performativity through action was in Colombia. So I'm Colombian and Australian. And when I was living in Colombia, the mayor of Bogota, who was going to be elected, Antanas Mocus, he made a film that my cousin worked on. And I was introduced to this work that he did. So he came from a university, he came from humanities and philosophy. And so he had a kind of different style of managing people and affecting change. And one thing that he did was hire mimes to train people how to use the sidewalk or to control traffic. And this was really powerful because it really changed the way people behaved on city streets, just by using this kind of very basic means of performance through using mimes. And so this to me tells me that performativity and how we actually rehearse or simulate or embody other ways of being gives us insight and gives us the ability to transition ourselves, right? Which has this power. And then also in Colombia, I did this work around systems theater, which is basically based off Teatro Foro and Augusto Boal, who is a Brazilian theater maker who published this book called Acting Games for Non-Actors. And I spent 2 weeks at the University of Ibagué while I was doing some research there. Sorry, there's a lot of ambulances all the time, right? Because we're living in ridiculous times. So while I was in Colombia doing this work a few years ago, I was introduced to this other dimension of conflict. And then conflict became a really central part, and embodying systems and conflict in systems in the kind of work that I do. And this is an example of students from SVA in New York embodying food systems, so whole food systems. So the person that you see probably to your right, she's a vegetable getting massaged by a farmer. And so what happens is when you start to use your body, you can start to embody a carrot. What does that mean? How's life for a carrot? And what does that tell us about how we can do things differently, looking at the systems and the interdependencies of that system to be able to generate futures and alternative futures that way, ultimately to be able to transition to them, right? And so to go into something that is less about people and more about some things that we are more closer to is artifacts. How can that kind of experience engagement be produced through artifacts? So the Conversational Implant, which is a project that was done, led by my other colleagues at Becoming, is a really beautiful example of how you start to see these things come together through an artifact. So this conversational implant is a plant it is an AI. So it is natural and it is artificial and it interacts with humans. And the thing that I think is most interesting about this piece of work is that it has the same feedback loops as people interacting with each other, because you're interacting with a plant and an AI. And the idea is that you can speak to this plant. But what is more important, or what I find more interesting, is that the AI is not made up by typical algorithms. The AI is made up by feminist writers, which means that when you're interacting with the plant, you're also interacting with a feminist plant. And what does that mean? If you embody feminism into a plant that you can then interact with through artificial intelligence, what does that tell us about how we can interact with artificial intelligence differently? And then if you think about humanoids, or what is kind of digital humans are a thing right now, they're always female and they're always personified as human. But why are they human? Why can't they be a plant? So how does this tell us about how we can be interacting with the world differently if we embody a feminist AI into a plant? And it's the same with this project. So this is going more into the commercial sphere. So before I left Australia, which was quite recently, I did a project with Arup, which is they're a big kind of construction company, engineering, etc. So they build a lot of city stuff. And an organization called Old Ways New. And so we ran a futuring workshop with Old Ways New to facilitate Old Ways New and Arup to create a future city or a future precinct place in Sydney that was designed from the perspective of Indigenous knowledges specific to that place. And what we did was we worked with elders that were from that place. We had ceremony before we started the workshop. And instead of using pure just your bodies or things to design with, what we did was we hosted the workshop on country, which means, you were designing on the place and you were using the traditional knowledges of that place, but also designing with the natural material of that place. So before we started the workshop, everyone went for a walk and collected things from country to create with. So if you like, that is the prototyping material to manifest the city. Brilliant. And this is what the elder of this community, of this place, had to say about the city.
With various locations within, but it's all about interconnection, and it's all about interweaving the presences of places.
Yeah.
So I find that as a really inspiring way of looking at the narrative going forward as to what this might actually end up looking like. A bit like that.
So by designing with this other embodied knowledge, the embodied knowledge of this material of place, then you can reframe how this place will actually manifest in 20 years, understanding the systems of nature in that place to manifest into the infrastructure, the built infrastructure of that place. Which is a really, I think it's quite a fascinating thing to design with country. And the organization that we were working with is an Indigenous organization that all of the work that they do is country-centered. So how you future with country-centered design is that you future from the knowledge of country. So not your knowledge, the knowledge of country. And does that enter impossible space? I think it does. So one of the last projects that I'm going to share with you that also touches on this idea of looking at variables and impossible becomings is this game that we've created that so far we've run in Australia, Spain, Netherlands, Mexico, and United States. It's Control Words, and it is probably like the funnest thing I've ever experienced, and I've run it like a few times, and it's really quite fun. And so the idea of Control Words is that you use all of these different things as your tension, as your perspective, to be able to create moves from different perspectives to create the world that you want. So imagine I have a vision, and you have a vision, and someone else has a vision, and someone else has a vision. And you're all trying to realize your visions for the future, but they're all contesting each other. And so you have to fight to realize your vision. And I'm going to show you how this plays out. So it has evolved quite a bit over the last few years, and we have experimented with a few different ways. But again, it is about what do you bring to this experience that help others to do the futuring as well. Because another thing is, I don't really care about the future that I create, but we all need to expand our imaginaries, right? So I am more interested in creating the conditions that allows others to do the futuring. And what are those right conditions that produce impossible futures, that actually break us out of what we know and start to embody and inhabit the unknown. And that is really the beauty of this game. And so because to celebrate Lourdes, I'm going to show you some of what we did in New York at Primer, because this is quite funny.
We started to spread out our organic mushroom network. So through the guise of eco-conservation, we're using terraforming techniques to create optimal environments for growing our psychedelic mushroom network as it kind of spreads throughout the land. And it's helping to support the network to help grow the universal basic income and to help support a platform into space and help you get connected and distribute to let more people know that if that's the way they want to reach their enlightenment, and help to share our quantum love to bring fear back from our friends over in the corner. So it lives hidden underneath the current networks we all learned about in 2022. So it's post-nation state. It's separate, but it's open to all. It helps spread the quantum love and everyone is everyone, and to continue on our 1,000-year rave journey, oneness with all and sharing the empathy.
Mm-hmm. Oneness with oneness. The oneness within myself.
Use tools to control the weather and the geological behavior of our planet so you can grow mushrooms. We are not only making it rain a lot to make all you sad, and the festival is not going to be like as sunny as you hope, but we're also planning to infiltrate as hippie ravers to better know you, to identify surveillance. How are you organizing yourself? How are you your new proposal? So let's see what's happening in the third move. But for now, we are doing geoengineering to destroy your mushrooms and make it rain.
Mushrooms need
Wow.
rain.
We like rain.
The mushrooms need rain.
Okay, whatever.
Look at rain. Really good. Really good. So this shows you one aspect of Control Words, the conflict, right? So there is one group that I believe are DIY techno shamanists. And then there is another group who is some kind of totalitarian, I don't know, transhumanist people. And they have obviously conflicting beliefs, values that shape how they imagine what a desirable future looks like. So what happens when you put two desirable futures against each other and you say, now I want you to enact this future, I want you to create strategies and actions to arrive at the future you want, but you also have to fight these three other groups that are also trying to create their future. And what you see is the dark matter and the tension between everything that happens between these different actors trying to create different futures. And that gives you real insight in how you can actually navigate change, because all of a sudden you've created this space for unknown, for this conflict, for this tension that is not static. It is pure simulation. Here is another example from a climate control wars. And so again, from the perspectives of 4 different groups who were all trying to address climate change from their perspective, there is still conflict. So we can say, are you a climate denialist? You don't care about the climate. But actually, everyone wants more or less to do a thing that is good for them. But what is the thing that is good for them? And how does it play out against others? And so one thing that happens in the game is that you decide that I'm going to be more powerful if I converge with somebody else. What does that look like? Who's doing what to be able to converge?
We looked at, because these guys had a really lovely idea of community where the nations don't exist, and the wealth is redistributed to the poor. But then they didn't quite have the ability to connect with as many people as we did through our eco-sex system. So we kind of fused the model of community with the technology of eco-sex AI, and used that passion and sexuality to imprint a new desire on the rest of the population, which I think you guys are clearly getting and like starting to the reason why I think they don't need wealth anymore is because the wealth of pleasure that's abundant through the earth now is there, it's really influential, and yeah, and because there's no need for the profit motive anymore since wealth has been redistributed, and people don't, and we don't have this infrastructure, the need to get wealth from the earth's resources like fossil fuels and such.
So the benefit of doing this is in the conversation. So if you think of this as a tool for experimental ethnography or ethnographic futures research, it is in the conversation. So each of these individuals inhabit a perspective that is trying to act on the world differently. But in their perspective, they start to say, oh, you know, well, there's this thing that exists, this fiction that exists around eco-sex. But these guys over there, they have this thing all about community. Now, if we combine community with eco-sex, then we can reduce fossil fuels and blah, blah, blah. But they embody the fiction by playing the game. And that allows them to address these very complex and often contradictory issues that actually give us insight back onto the future. So, you know, there is this quote by Ursula Le Guin that says, truth is a matter of the imagination, and fiction is a reflection on reality. So by playing these games, we are expanding our imaginaries, but we're also able to reflect back on reality after the fact to say, wow, well, eco-sex is a bit of a ridiculous idea, and how artificial intelligence is embodied into that. I'm not sure, I can't remember. But it also gives us insight into the fact that right now we are very much trying to reconnect our relationship with nature. And how deep does that go? What does that tell us? The second part of this workshop, we took it a step further to reflect while doing the same interaction of playing a game, but by plating food. And this was something that was run by my partner, who's a chef. But it was done with native ingredients. We had with us as well an Indigenous leader to ensure that that representation is there, which is an important thing in Australia. But in doing this act in these two very different ways, the participants are able to embody themselves in a different way. And it can almost be like therapy. So what we've been doing lately, so the kind of key ingredients to control walls are different archetypes. So usually, or, you know, there's something like, you know, DIY, techno-shamanists, luxury, accelerationists, these kinds of things. I'm going to show you some now. So that is one aspect, to give you the perspective and the values that is shaping action. The other is, what are our tactics? So standards, governance, terraforming, datafied surveillance, all of these things are the tension that feeds control wars. And they're all things that shape our reality right now. But if we bring them into contact with conflict, does it give us new insight into those specific things? So we're doing this online control wars in response to COVID, not necessarily to come up with 4 futures of these are the scenarios that are likely to come from this situation, but to really show what are the perspectives that we're seeing emerging out of COVID, and how are these perspectives ultimately going to compete against each other to shape what happens next. And I think it is very difficult right now to understand what's going to happen next, because we're all just sitting in our apartments, probably wanting to go outside. And things keep changing so quickly that this is the perfect time where you cannot be rational. You need to embrace the ridiculous, because this is a ridiculous event. So going into control wars, COVID control wars, we have algorithmic social engineers, we have accelerationists, luxury communalists, we have transhuman libertarianists, techno-shamanists, market pirate and money guards, and dark age conspiracy, I can't say this word, but you get the idea. They're like conspiracy people. And all of these people have, or all of these representations have different tensions that shape what is likely to come. And so this is going to be a slightly different experience, because it's going to be online, and it's going to be run across a week in different geographies, and it'll be very thoughtful. There will be a lot of storytelling around it, but ultimately it is still looking at these different tensions that inform our future. That is from my favorite workshop I ever ran, which is also in Colombia. And these women are taking power over these men, and that's just amazing. So that went like a lot longer than I had anticipated. So I think, coming back to my first point around the future as a mirage, disorienting the present, is what I want to come back to, because we often think of the future as orienting the present, but it also disorients the present. And what is more beneficial? I don't know. So I think let's quickly, in like the 5 minutes we have, answer 1 or 2 questions. Lourdes, did you pick up on some? I'm going to look at them now. But
yeah, Grace, if you have time, people have time, maybe we can grab a beer, have a
time.
good...
I have time. I took a lot of time. So
Okay, with also we have like in 4 minutes the applause. So whoever wants to applaud can go, or we can do it all together here. But please stay because we have lots of questions. We want to know more. And I could also later, if anybody have a question about control words through a individual perspective as a participant, was amazing, and I would love to talk afterwards about that.
Okay.
So you have the chat. You can start from the beginning.
Okay, all right. I'm going to start from the beginning. Hi, it says hi.
You know.
All right.
So
I'm taking a look. Wait. Does any, okay, I'm gonna.
For example, Steph, I think Steph has the first question.
I can't see what methodologies to apply. What is the first, can you tell me what do you see?
Or maybe you can.
I totally agree. Oh. The future only similars will fit.
Steph, maybe you can.
Yeah, explain your question, Steph.
Can I speak or should I shut down my, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, it came to my mind because when you said that most of these images of the future, you can see all of these white men, particularly similar one to each other. So that came to my mind is like, in all of these visions of the future, only similar people are on them. I mean, all of the things that we are building at the same time, perhaps only the mainstream people could fit them. And what happens with the people, with the eccentric people, or the not similar? Did I explain myself?
Not normative.
Yeah, exactly.
Grace, could you stop your sharing screen so we can see each other? Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Wait.
Perfect.
Yeah. Okay. So not normative people, images of the future. I think, well, I think a lot of old white men shape our futures, and that's like just been a structural thing. Even, you know, I did this personal experiment one time, looking at science fiction writers to understand how many clicks in Google search do I need to go to before getting to a female science fiction writer. And it was this like really amazing thing that happened. I think I clicked on Philip K. Dick, and on Google, all of the authors come up, other science fiction usual suspects came up. Then I think I clicked on William Gibson to see who else would come up. Then I think, and like, so there's 12, then there's another 12. Then I clicked on Bruce Sterling and another 12. And because Bruce Sterling's wife is also a science fiction writer, and they have a close connection because they're married, his wife was in the list. So I was like, finally, the first, 30 science fiction writers in, I find a woman. Then I click on the woman, and there is Ursula Le Guin, there's Margaret Atwood, and Octavia Butler. So, and a few others. But Octavia Butler was the first African-American woman to come up in this sea of white, right? But then this beautiful thing happened when I clicked on Octavia Butler. this like sea of activists, really beautiful speculative fiction writers started coming into the narrative of here are other people writing science fiction. And so I think you have to dig so deeply to be able to consume futures that are alternative. And yeah, so I think for the most part, even all of our images of the future, they mostly come from Blade Runner. You know, there's what's the new one, June's coming. So there is, yeah, you get what I'm saying.
So we have another one from Ana Sarasola. Do you think COVID-19 crisis will enable more disruptive futures to come up?
Yeah.
I am curious if you been ridiculous dealing with it.
What do you say? How ridiculous ways?
You been ridiculous dealing with it?
Yeah, I did a really ridiculous run in the street before, because I feel really like in the last few days, like, I don't know, you know, in Spain, it's like, I can't imagine what it must be like in Spain. I can go outside in Amsterdam, but in the last week, I want to tear off my skin. And all I feel like is being outside of my body, because I haven't been able to engage with my body. And I think that what that happens, and you're sitting in front of, even like right now, you're sitting in front of the computer all day, and you're in meetings all day, just on the computer. And it's like, I just want to like pick up the computer and be like, I want to interact with you, you know? And you can't. So it's kind of like I feel like there is a risk that we can't get some ridiculous futures. But at the same time, we're getting really interesting signals about the ridiculous, right? And I think my favorite is animals. So animal behavior during COVID is like my savior, because animals are doing such weird things, you know? And that's like a really beautiful thing.
Totally. We have another one here. Someone asking, could you share the name of the artist or design studio that envisioned the feminist plant artifact?
That's Becoming. That is the studio that we work. That is our studio.
And we have another one from Alberto Barreiro. Hi, Grace. What if the most ridiculous, imaginative way of thinking about the future is negating the possibility of a future? Humans live without an idea of the future for most of our history, and that gave us a space for magical thinking in an eternal present.
Yeah, well, the future is a construct, right? And I think this comes back to my point around the future is a mirage, disorienting the present. Mm-hmm. And I think this because the reason you use, you know, I work with, you know, I'm a part of Becoming. That is the thing that brings me joy and passion. And tactfully, I work also in Deloitte to bring this thinking, to see if I can shift some of the thinking in an organization like Deloitte to start thinking like this. And what I have seen in this time in Deloitte and outside of Deloitte, right? It's kind of like everyone's like, I'm going to produce these scenarios that is going to say, this is how we're going to come out of COVID. And what it does, it engenders specific futures. And those specific futures are causing a lot of confusion on what we're doing right now. So they almost become this mirage, which is an illusion of what's going to happen, because we don't know what's going to happen. But we're also not comfortable, and I'm speaking mainly in, you know, a Western context, we're not comfortable with unknowing what's going to happen, particularly when it comes to economics. And I think we have, our body remembers the fear of the last recession, And so I think we're afraid, you know, there's we have this fear of the unknown. We can't sit comfortably in the unknown. So this mirage of what can come next disorientates us. And so if we look at the future as an internal present, that actually anything can change right now, and it is void of space and time, we can actually, kind of like Neverland, you know, we can think more imaginatively. Does that respond to the question?
Are you still
Yes,
there?
very
There are
much.
like some
Yes.
problems with it.
Yeah, thanks.
Grace, we have a reflection from Cesar Astudillo, and it's related to what you just said about Deloitte, that a number of large and not so large private companies are starting to get interest in design futures, in the expectation that that will help them discover new markets, come up with disruptive innovation, and devise long-term plans. To what extent do you believe design futures can be useful for this? Do you think these companies are bound to be disappointed or enlightened? And I don't know if it is there, but it's freeze. Your video is freeze.
I'm frozen?
Yes. Oh, no, you came back.
I don't think larger organizations are as interested in design futures as the design futures community thinks they are. I think that large organizations like Deloitte have heritage in strategic sensing and scenario planning. So if you think of, you know, old school scenario planning that is void of design, that is typically what organizations that Deloitte supports is interested in, because it helps them orientate actions and align their strategy, right? Understanding provocation. So first, I'll just speak to provocation. Provocations are super useful in a research context to learn about behavior change. And that is useful to understand what is right and what is wrong, and what is the implication and impact of certain decisions. So where an organization, I'll give you an example right now, because of this situation, a lot of our health services have to be digitized, because we can't go to a health clinic, we can't go to hospital. Everyone that is already dealing with chronic illness that has to stay at home still need health services. So you can say that, so basically you digitize your health services, and that can be done in a bad way or a good and responsible way. So I think what bigger organizations are starting to try and understand is how to do things more responsibly, and where design futures comes into play in those larger organizations like in Deloitte is understanding, taking the analysis capability of an organization like this that can look at very complex economic trends and use that as productive tension to make decisions that move, that help an organization make better choices around their actions in how they do things right now. Because if you are a health organization that has to go online, that has to digitize, you can do that in a good way or a bad way. And essentially, I think the only way that design futuring can really help is to help orientate that action, if that makes sense. But pure—
Absolutely, thank you very much.
Yeah.
There's another question related to the control work. What methodology do you use to facilitate the fight?
Control was methodology. So I think the control walls is made up of, well, you know, it was actually made in a really interesting way. And it was never kind of, it was not originally designed with the intention to do what it can do now, which is really to kind of guide transition. So when we made it up, we were taking input from recursive feedback loops that you get. So looking at cybernetics. So the recursive feedback loops that you get in systems theater, we were integrating that, but also that was kind of the foundation. But I think that's more or less the foundation. And serious games, you know.
How do you think how the present and past history versus her story was wrote is impacting the way futures are speculated? So the male point of view of history, how this is impacting the way futures are speculated.
So I'm trying to find the question. Tell me again.
From D. Salvidea. How do you think how the present and past history versus her story was wrote is impacting the way futures are speculated?
Well, yeah, I think that there's no females in history. if that's what you mean. So I think, and I'm just going to give my personal experience, because I think what happens is we grow up and we have these belief systems and we start to challenge them and we try to future ourselves. And we have a lot of internal conflict. And sometimes we try and repress that. And what that means is that we limit our ability to imagine other futures in a very basic way. But then if we start to really challenge our beliefs, then we can start to think about other things. And I think what is really unfortunate for women is the fact that there are very little stories in history that we can look back on to say, oh, wow, I identify with that. I'm going to take that narrative and I'm going to embody it and I'm going to act with that. Right? So as an example, and I think you start to see shifts in fiction that create new kind of possibility. So I'm a Colombian Australian, and I grew up in Australia with no other Colombians besides my family. And so I always had this really weird tension with everyone around me because I was really different. And that I couldn't like fully feel myself because I had this internal conflict and I was separated across continents. But more so than that, I'm a queer woman and a Catholic woman. Well, you know, I grew up Catholic. And so but I'm spiritual, you know, so I think you have to deal with these things. I didn't see any queer women in my history, you know, but now you're starting to see all of these like famous, or you're starting to see this historical representation of lesbians. And it's like, wow, they existed. I didn't know they existed, but they existed back there. So you have to search for your history. But if you can't search for your history, and it's the same in Australia. So Australian history is super fragmented because we've been told a fake history. We haven't been told our Indigenous history. So we've had to really search for what is our Indigenous history? How does that make Australians now? And how does that make Australia in a new time if we start to bring in that knowledge, you know? So yeah, I think I answered that.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, you did.
So I think that's it. Grace, do you want to share something before we go, or I don't know if there is someone who wants to ask the last question. I don't think so. So
right. Well, I hope you can all use your bodies during this time. And if you want to know anything else about becoming and control wars, I think we shared the link in the invite. And we're looking for some volunteers to test the first round of of the COVID control wars. So if you're interested, reach out, and thank you for listening to me for so long.
thank you. It was amazing, Grace. Thank you.
Thank you.
We will share the links with all of you. And yes, I think everybody wants to participate in these COVID control wars. I highly recommend it because it's super fun, and also you realize how you transit, no? How is the transition to the present to the future? So, and how it collides with other vision of the future. You really have to experiment it to realize it. So I highly recommend it.
I'm glad you liked it. It's really amazing. It's like, it really has this other, I'm not just being a spokesperson, because I've learned through making the thing that it really gives you this other dimension of transition.
Yeah, totally.
You know, anyway.
Thank
I
you.
could think about it for hours.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Grace.
Have fun.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.